Hello. The darkness that descended upon Europe in the mid-20th century was not born solely of ideological fervor and martial aggression. It was meticulously funded, cleverly disguised, and ultimately sustained by an economic architecture of unparalleled cynicism and parasitism. When the world recalls the rise of Adolf Hitler's Third Reich, the images are often those of fanatical stormtroopers, the atrocities of the Holocaust, or the vast, destructive scope of the Second World War. Few, however, consider the role of the seemingly mundane figures, the gray, ordinary clerks and financial engineers who crafted the economic engine that gave life to this monstrous war machine. One such man was Hjalmar Schacht. Unheard of by the general public, he, like many other leaders of the Third Reich, found himself in the dock at the Nuremberg trials. Schacht gave no orders to kill. His contribution was far more insidious. He was the chief financial architect who found the fuel to power the apparatus that would eventually claim tens of millions of lives. Understanding how a defeated, economically devastated Germany could rapidly build such a formidable military force requires moving past the simple notions of vast gold reserves or captured laborers and looking instead at the financial genius of Schacht and the structure of the Reich's predatory economy. This is the story of how the parasitic economy of the Third Reich was truly constructed, and what ultimately caused its inevitable collapse. The path to power for Adolf Hitler was paved not just by political maneuvering, but by profound global catastrophe. His ascent and ultimate victory were indelibly linked to the devastating world economic crisis, the Great Depression. As noted by the German social democrat Victor Schiff in the Magazine of Socialism in 1934, Hitler's success was built on the despair of millions. The crisis fed the desperation of the unemployed, the educated youth with no prospects, the small business owners facing bankruptcy, and the farmers crushed by falling agricultural prices. The Great Depression, which began in the United States of America with the stock market crash of 1929, swiftly engulfed the globe. The interconnected nature of the global financial system meant that economic pain in one major power instantly spread worldwide. Many European nations, including Germany, were deeply reliant on American loans or engaged in active trade with the United States. As the U.S. economy lay in ruins, investors frantically withdrew capital, and the flow of credit dried up entirely. Germany was particularly vulnerable. To recover after the First World War, the country had actively courted foreign investment, succeeding remarkably well. By 1929, it had received 27 billion Reichsmarks in loans, a staggering 36% of its contemporary gross domestic product. When external creditors suddenly demanded repayment of debts, the consequences for the German economy were catastrophic. The country's gross domestic product plummeted by nearly 1/3 in the 4 years following the Great Depression. Unemployment soared, leaving 1 in 5 citizens without work by the early 1930s. It was precisely at this critical juncture, amidst the most acute crisis, that Adolf Hitler seized the political stage. His party's share of the vote jumped from 18% in 1930 to over 37% by the 1932 elections, making it the largest force in the Reichstag, German parliament. He offered concrete promises to every segment of the populace: protection for farmers, jobs for workers, new contracts for industrialists, and a strong army for the military. These were not abstract slogans, but a blueprint for action. To understand how Hitler managed to resurrect the German economy from the ashes of the Great War and the Depression, one must examine the specific pillars of the Third Reich's economic project. One of the most numerous yet weakest social groups in early 1932 Germany were the farmers. The crisis had caused many nations to impose high tariffs on imported food to protect their own domestic farmers. German farmers were therefore restricted to selling their produce domestically, where the population, struggling with massive unemployment, was too poor to buy much food. Farmers were forced to constantly lower prices just to sell anything, resulting in their collective income dropping from approximately 10 billion Reichsmarks in 1928 to 1929 to just 6. 5 Billionen Reichsmarks bei 1932 bis 1933. Like the rest of the country, many farmers were also deeply in debt from post-World War I loans. The National Socialist regime brilliantly capitalized on this plight to secure the farmers' support. Propaganda posters contrasted the old power, represented by a bailiff at a farmer's door ready to seize property for debt, with the supposed threat of Bolshevism, collective farming and revolution, and the National Socialist vision, as it should be. This vision, symbolized by a farmer working a field under an enormous swastika, promised stability, order, and prosperity. Hitler delivered on his promise, but on his own terms. In September 1933, the hereditary farm law was passed, granting land to farmers. Crucially, this land could not be sold, divided, mortgaged, or seized for debts. It was, however, restricted to passing down only through the male line of inheritance. The price of this security was the farmer's freedom. The peasant was permanently tethered to his plot. Moving to a city, or changing profession, was effectively forbidden. Furthermore, the Reich food estate, Reichsnährstand, a mandatory organization, was created for all farmers. Its purpose was straightforward. All peasants were compelled to sell their entire harvest, minus the food needed for their families, to the state at fixed, predetermined prices. Selling goods on the open market became a violation. The fixed price system was presented not as a limitation, but as salvation from the inherent risks of the market unpredictability in yields, logistics, supply, and demand that could lead to crippling losses, as seen during the Great Depression. Farmers willingly embraced fixed prices, and in return, the state gained absolute control over the nation's food supply, from the field to the shelf. The figures attested to the system's success, at least in financial terms. Farmers' total revenue rose from the crisis low of 6.5 billion Reichsmarks in 1932 to 1933 to 3 billion Reichsmarks by 1937 to 1938, almost reaching pre-crisis levels. Yet, feeding the nation was only one part of Hitler's promise. The Reich required roads, factories, ships, homes, and military bases, everything necessary to transform Germany into the dominant European power. This vast construction and industrialization project was assigned to the second pillar of the National Socialist economy, the working class. In 1933, Germany faced catastrophic unemployment, with roughly 6 million people, a fifth of the population, out of work. Within 4 years, this figure was miraculously reduced to less than 1 million. While propaganda heavily promoted compulsory labor service and national unity, it was clear that slogans alone could not build factories or start production lines. Jobs are created only when the manufacturing sector is vibrant and receives a constant flow of orders. In the 1,930 seconds, the economic crisis meant individuals and companies lacked the capital to participate in the produce, sell, buy cycle. The solution was simple and monumental. The state itself became the primary customer. Government investments in the German economy skyrocketed from a mere 2.2 billion Reichsmarks in 1932 to 10.3 billion by 1938, an increase of nearly fivefold. The mechanism for financing these state orders was a financial innovation that masked its true inflationary and militaristic nature. Consider the state's need for uniforms for the Schutzstaffel, SS, a supplier, such as the company Hugo Boss, a historical fact, as the now fashionable house-designed uniforms for the Third Reich's troops, including the famous black SS uniform and the uniform for the Hitler Youth, would fulfill the order. Instead of cash, however, the supplier received a governmental promise to pay, a form of valuable security issued by a large private German bank, such as the Deutsche Bank. Once the work was complete, the supplier could cash the security at any bank. The private bank that paid out the cash would then present this obligation to the state-controlled Reichsbank, German central bank, which would debit the state's account and, if necessary, print additional currency to cover the cost. This seemingly complex system was a sophisticated alternative to simple money printing. Straightforward printing of money injects currency into the economy. Accelerating demand faster than production can increase supply, which inevitably pushes prices up. Inflation. In the National Socialist scheme, however, money was created against specific state orders and entered circulation only after the producer had completed the work and delivered the goods or services. The money was immediately backed by real production and output. This mechanism was instrumental in reviving the German economy in the first year of Hitler's rule, pulling it out of its fatal spiral. State orders provided manufacturers with the necessary capital and workers with jobs and wages. However, just as with the farmers, the workers paid for this stability with their rights. Hitler dismantled all independent trade unions, the very organizations that fought for better wages, working conditions, and safety. In their place, a single, all-encompassing union, the German Labor Front, Deutsche Arbeitsfront, was established, which was fully subservient to the party and the state. Strikes, which had been the workers' primary tool to demand their rights, were officially banned. Through the single union, the state gained near absolute control over the labor market, determining working conditions and wage levels, which remained suspiciously stable. This system was designed to serve the interests of the industrialists who financed the Third Reich, not to protect the workers. In 1935, the system of labor passbooks, Arbeitsbuch, was introduced. While superficially similar to a standard work record in the Reich, the passbook was kept by the employer. A worker wishing to quit and find a new job needed this document. The employer could simply refuse to release the passbook, effectively preventing the worker from being hired elsewhere. Employers literally held their workers on a leash. Despite stagnant wages and this effective enslavement, there was no widespread revolt. Workers were generally content because the state guaranteed stability and food, a stark contrast to the mass layoffs and factory closures they had experienced during the crisis. This system successfully drove unemployment down to near zero by 1939. To finance the massive military buildup, a process that was illegal under the Treaty of Versailles, the regime required a mechanism that could procure and pay for military equipment without raising suspicion from the League of Nations inspection commissions. The Treaty of Versailles, signed after Germany's defeat in World War I, had imposed crushing reparations and drastically limited the German armed forces to just 100,000 men, forbidding heavy warships, submarines, military aviation, tanks, and chemical weapons. The League of Nations was tasked with monitoring compliance through inspections and auditing official accounting records. The earlier system of state orders, while effective for domestic purposes like uniforms, led to a visible increase in official state debt, which could attract the attention of the League of Nations inspectors. To procure tanks and other prohibited weaponry, a brilliant yet deceptive idea emerged. All rearmament orders would be legally financed not by the state, but by private companies. Since the League of Nations' focus was primarily on state military structures and armaments, a private company conducting its own business would presumably arouse no suspicion. In 1934, the key financial tool was created, the Metallurgical Research Institute Corporation, Metallurgische Forschungsgesellschaft, or Mefo. This company did not produce anything itself. It functioned as an intermediary. It placed military production orders with German manufacturers and paid them not with cash, but with its own promissory notes, known as Mefo bills. The Reichsbank guaranteed these bills, making them as reliable as state bonds to the businesses receiving them. Crucially, Mefo bills were designed to discourage immediate cashing. They offered a 4% annual interest rate, compared to 3% on other state securities, and their maturity date could be repeatedly extended. The longer a Mefo bill remained in the hands of a company, the longer the state avoided the obligation to pay out Reichsmarks. From 1934 to 1938, 12 billion Reichsmarks worth of Mefo bills were issued, with only 1/3 ever redeemed at the Reichsbank. The rest circulated among military contractors, effectively creating a parallel shadow currency for the rearmament program. This Mefo bill loophole allowed Germany to finance a gigantic rearmament program without fueling inflation or exposing the true extent of its military expenditures in official statistics. The spending appeared in the books as ordinary transactions between private companies, not as a centralized buildup of the German military machine. Companies such as Mercedes-Benz, manufacturing aircraft engines, trucks, military vehicles, and even fighter aircraft, and Ford, whose German subsidiary produced trucks for the army, were among the state's clientele. The regime also shamelessly defrauded its own citizens. In 1934, Hitler launched the slogan, "A German car for every family." To achieve this, the car had to cost 1,000 Reichsmarks, a massive reduction from the 2,650 Reichsmarks price tag of a small civilian Opel at the time. A typical worker, earning an average salary of 75 Reichsmarks per month, could theoretically buy such a car in 3 years if they saved every single penny. To build this people's car, the Volkswagen, literally people's car, concern was founded in 1937. Ferdinand Porsche, one of its chief engineers, developed the compact car prototype for the 1,000 Reichsmark target, which would later become the basis for the iconic Beetle. Since 1,000 Reichsmarks was still too much for the average worker to pay up front, Germans were encouraged to make weekly deposits of 5 Reichsmarks into a savings fund to save up for their car. By the end of 1,939, 270,000 Germans had lent the government 110 million Reichsmarks. However, as the country openly prepared for war, the authorities declared that the nation needed military equipment, not civilian cars. Not a single worker ever received their eagerly awaited people's car. The resurrection of the German war machine required more than just labor control and hidden debt. It needed technology and resources. Despite its role as the aggressor in World War I, Germany found many allies, willing to prioritize financial interests over ideals, or oppose their own rivals. The League of Nations, established to prevent future wars, notably lacked the participation of the United States of America, which chose to pursue its own interests. The U.S. signed a separate peace treaty with Germany in 1921, identical to the Treaty of Versailles, but omitting any mention of the League of Nations. The U.S. had a vested interest in Germany's recovery. Following World War I, nearly all of Europe was indebted to the U.S. for $12.5 billion in military aid. Germany, in turn, was obliged to pay $33 billion in reparations to the European allies. The cycle was clear. Germany owed Europe, and Europe owed the U.S. The U.S. could only recoup its loans if the German economy, the weakest in Europe, was allowed to grow. The U.S. actively stimulated the German economy by extending credit between 1,925 and 1,930. Nearly 7 billion Reichsmarks in U.S. loans poured into Germany. This capital injection fueled a 34% increase in Germany's national income and propelled its industrial output past that of Great Britain and France, making it the second largest in the world, behind only the United States. This growth halted in 1930 with the Great Depression, as American capital was hastily pulled out, plunging Germany into crisis and paving the way for Hitler. Hitler was determined not to repeat the mistakes of his predecessors, ensuring that if foreigners were to profit from the German economy, it would be on his terms. To prevent a repeat of the massive capital flight during the Great Depression, the regime implemented a regime of monetary autarky in 1936. The Reichsmark was no longer freely convertible into foreign currencies, and all foreign exchange earnings from external economic activity belonged exclusively to the Reichsbank, German central bank. A case in point was the American automaker General Motors, which had acquired the German automaker Opel just before the crisis in 1929. If General Motors' Swiss subsidiary, a plant that assembled Opel parts from Germany, paid for a shipment in Swiss francs, the payment did not go directly to Opel. Instead, the foreign currency went to the Reichsbank, which then gave Opel the equivalent in Reichsmarks, the national currency the state could print at will. The Reichsbank thus concentrated foreign currency, vital for purchasing foreign war materials, while the company received only local currency and lost control over its external earnings. Why would foreign companies continue to operate under such restrictive conditions, unable to repatriate profits? Because the German economy was growing rapidly, and military orders were plentiful. While Reichsmarks could not be converted and exported to the US, they could be reinvested within Germany to expand production and develop technology, which was booming due to the National Socialist regime's massive military orders, many of which were placed with foreign companies. General Motors, through its German subsidiary Opel, provided the National Socialist military with trucks and aircraft components, sharing technical data that would later be used to produce the iconic Messerschmitt Me 262 fighter jet. The economic strategy of the Third Reich was not based on sustainable growth but on a planned, total mobilization for war. In 1936, Hermann Göring, the commander-in-chief of the Air Force, declared two things. First, that every piece of steel and every oil drum was to be used for armament. And second, that the German economy must be mobilized for war within 4 years. The world community, though fully aware of Germany's military ambitions, failed to act. A key foreign policy goal of Hitler was the creation of a Greater Germany, Großdeutschland, uniting all ethnic Germans living outside the Reich. This led to a territorial expansion strategy that was, at its core, an economic resource grab. The first target was Austria, a former territory of the German and Austro-Hungarian empires. Through a campaign of propaganda, terrorism, and sabotage, Austrian National Socialists destabilized the country, culminating in the German annexation, Anschluss, in March 1938. The economic prize of Austria was immense. Germany absorbed 1.8 billion Reichsmarks in Austrian gold and foreign currency reserves. This single acquisition provided the Reich with critical resources that could not be devalued or printed, bolstering its ability to finance its military machine. Next was Czechoslovakia. Its selection was not arbitrary. It was the sole industrialized nation in Central Europe created after World War I, possessing a developed economy and a strategically vital location. Hitler manufactured a pretext by exploiting the ethnic German population in the Sudetenland. After aggressive provocations and armed clashes, Hitler leveraged the persecution of the German minority as an excuse to pressure Prague. The Munich Agreement of 1938, signed by Great Britain, France, and Italy, allowed Germany to annex the Sudetenland. 6 months later, in March 1939, German troops occupied the rest of the Czech lands, creating the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. The true value of this conquest was the industry. The Škoda Works, Czechoslovakia's industrial heart, became a critical supplier for the Third Reich. This factory and others like it churned out tanks, artillery, and ammunition for the German army. By 1941, the German Wehrmacht, armed forces, relied on Czech production for 1/3 of its total armaments, a quarter of all Wehrmacht tanks, nearly a third of its heavy trucks, and 40% of its small arms were Czech-made. Czechoslovakia was not merely an occupied territory, but a vital industrial and strategic resource, a staging ground for new conquests. Even as Germany marched across Europe, neutral countries continued to enable its war effort. Sweden, though formally neutral, was a crucial supplier, providing the Third Reich with between 43% and 83% of its imported iron ore. The Swedish port of Luleå was specially refitted to facilitate the shipment of ore across the Baltic Sea to Germany. To secure these critical supply lines in the Baltic, Germany occupied Denmark, and to wage war on the sea against Great Britain, Norway. Switzerland's role was financial. Through Swiss banks, The Reich acquired loans and credits to pay for essential foreign resources when its own foreign currency reserves were insufficient. The Reichsbank would deposit gold, some of which was plundered from the reserves of occupied countries, into the Swiss National Bank. The Swiss National Bank would then convert this precious metal into foreign currency and credit it to the German account. These funds were used to purchase strategic raw materials, oil, tungsten, lead, and steel from other neutral nations, effectively bypassing the Allied trade restrictions. Germany also had ideological partners. Hungary, which had lost two-thirds of its territory after World War I, signed the Tripartite Pact on the 20th of November 1940, joining the alliance with Germany in the hope of recovering its former borders. A relationship of paramount importance was established with the Soviet Union. The Non-Aggression Pact between Germany and the Soviet Union, Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, signed in August 1939, partitioned Poland and delineated zones of influence in the Baltics, Finland, and other parts of Eastern Europe. Crucially, the pact guaranteed that the Soviet Union would not align with Great Britain and would become a significant economic partner of the Reich. The Soviet Union, in turn, viewed the pact as a temporary respite to mobilize its own army and economy. A separate trade agreement was signed, under which Germany supplied the Soviet Union with machine tools, industrial equipment, and advanced military technology. Why would the National Socialists provide technology to a potential future enemy? Because Germany's domestic mineral and resource reserves were projected to sustain a full-scale war for only 6 to 16 months, it urgently required a reliable counterparty whose supplies could not be blockaded by Great Britain. The Soviet Union became the ideal candidate, covering up to 70% of Germany's resource imports until June 1941. This guaranteed supply of vital raw materials was worth sharing technology. Having conquered most of Europe, the National Socialists intended to transform it into an efficient resource appendage for the Reich. From Berlin's perspective, these territories were not equal partners but subordinate entities with strictly defined roles. This led to a system of unparalleled economic exploitation. The conquest of territory meant redirecting its economic output entirely toward the German war effort. In 1940, the military and the front consumed 38% of Germany's gross domestic product. In occupied Belgium during the same year, the corresponding figure was a staggering 66%. From a purely military standpoint, this might seem logical. A victorious nation compels the defeated to fuel further conquest. From an economic perspective, however, this distribution was disastrous. The vast majority of production went to tanks, aircraft, uniforms, and soldier rations, not to civilian goods such as clothing, shoes, furniture, or household items. Consequently, the supply of everyday consumer goods rapidly dwindled year after year. If Germany and the occupied countries had used a single currency, citizens in both would have spent Reichsmarks on an increasingly limited range of goods, leading to soaring prices, instability for the Reichsmark, and widespread discontent due to scarcity and a loss of confidence in the regime. To avoid this, a complicated network of financial obligations was created between the central banks of the occupied territories and the Reichsbank in Berlin. This was called the clearing system. Imagine a French factory producing engines for German aircraft. The factory dutifully ships the engines to Germany. In a normal transaction, France would send an invoice, and Germany would pay. In the clearing system, the German buyer paid the French factory with French francs. These francs were not backed by gold or reserves. They were printed by the Bank of France, the French central bank, under German pressure. The Bank of France then recorded a credit for the amount in a clearing account with the Reichsbank in Berlin. Berlin now owed Paris money, but this debt existed only on paper in the Reichsbank's books. Effectively, the occupied countries were forced to pay for the war against themselves by lending credit to the Reich with their own currency. As a consequence of the clearing system, European central banks were forced to print money to fund the German occupation. By the end of 1944, Germany owed the participants in this fraudulent scheme nearly 30 billion Reichsmarks. which was a quarter of Germany's entire war budget. The inevitable result of this uncontrolled emission was hyperinflation. For instance, the French franc was devalued six-fold by the end of the war. The occupation was not just a financial drain. It was a brutal administrative nightmare. Maintaining control and suppressing resistance required a vast and expensive bureaucracy. The cost of maintaining this immense administrative machine was entirely borne by the occupied countries. The Reich's economy also relied heavily on forced labor, drawing in foreign workers to compensate for German men joining the military. By 1944, up to 7 million foreign workers were employed in German industry. While this was seemingly a free resource, the productivity of these workers was significantly lower, averaging 75% to 85% of that of German workers. French workers were relatively more efficient, but only constituted 17% of the forced labor population. The largest cohorts were Poles, 22%, and citizens of the Soviet Union, 33%, whose productivity was dramatically lower due to the appalling conditions of their servitude. The entire economic structure, the forced stabilization of domestic prices, the control over labor, the financial smoke and mirrors of the Mefo bills, the forced labor, and the looting of entire nations through the clearing system was nothing more than a giant, unsustainable pyramid scheme. It relied entirely on continuous expansion and conquest to feed itself, constantly requiring new resources, new gold, and new captive labor to service the growing debt. This reality brings us back to Hjalmar Schacht, the financial architect. He was tried at Nuremberg for his role in fueling the war machine. On the 1st of October 1946, Schacht was acquitted. Soviet judges pushed for a life sentence, but the prosecution failed to prove he was a devoted National Socialist supporter, only that he had helped Adolf Hitler. Schacht himself offered a defense that speaks volumes about the regime's foundation. My plans for the creation of jobs and the improvement of trade were nullified by Hitler's mania for war. I was still able to make my contribution to the cancellation of reparations, but my efforts to prevent the outbreak of war failed. The man, under whose power I managed to eradicate unemployment and restore the balance of trade later, destroyed all of this with his policy of war. History will pass judgment on this matter. Schacht's name remains forever entwined with the shadow of the Third Reich, a chilling reminder that when talent serves a destructive power, legal acquittal does not equal historical absolution. Every step, the occupation of other countries, the exploitation of labor, and the printing of Reichsmarks accelerated the Third Reich's inevitable collapse. The final, fatal flaw in this parasitic system was the failure to conquer the Soviet Union with its vast human and natural resources. Without this crucial fuel, the all-consuming German war machine was doomed. The Reich had built its prosperity not on its own strength, but on the systematic plunder of others. And when the source of plunder was halted, the entire parasitic structure began to decay, leading to its catastrophic, final demise. Thank you for watching. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Tell us in the comments what surprised you the most in this video, or what you found the most fascinating. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Many more thrilling, shocking, and mind-blowing stories are coming soon.